Today's lesson is Thai protests push for real change. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our program. I'm Roger.
And I'm Helen.
Today we've got a news story. You may have heard that things are going on in Thailand. And, things are not very optimistic there because we've got protesters there trying to change the government. And oftentimes the government says, nope, we're not going to change no matter what you do.
Yes, the citizens of Thailand in the past have tried to express their ideas about the government and ways that they think the government could improve. And this has happened many times in the past. But this time, the activities actually became much more prominent and it has attracted a lot of international attention.
That's right, and Thailand better clean up this situation soon because Thailand, of course, is a popular tourist destination. Yes, indeed, COVID-19 will eventually be a thing of the past and we'll be able to travel the world freely again, but hopefully by that time, Thailand will have cleaned up its mess there, or at least have cleaned up its political mess. So let's find out what this is all about. Let's read the first paragraph here, and then we'll come back to discuss it.
Thai protests push for real change. Student demonstrations in Thailand last year grew into nationwide protests, giving rise to a movement that demanded widespread political reform. By fall, the peaceful protests had grown in size and intensity despite the COVID-19 pandemic engulfing the capital, Bangkok.
大家好，第一部分我们看到单字 intensity 这个字是名词，指强度、强烈。例如 The intensity of a typhoon is measured by its wind speeds. 台风的强度是由风速来判断。或是 I had to look away due to the intensity of the light. 由于光线强烈，我必须转移视线。另外，除了上面的意思，这个字还可以指认真、投入。像是 The tennis star always plays with great intensity and focus, no matter who his opponent is. 那位网球明星总是极度认真而专注的比赛，不论他的对手是谁。
So today in the news, we're talking about Thai protests and the push for real change. So what are the protests about? It says here student demonstrations in Thailand last year grew into nationwide protests, giving rise to a movement that demanded widespread political reform. So demonstrations here, students held demonstrations. Now, demonstration is when a large group of people gather together to protest about something. And often in recent history, demonstrations have been held by students because they are the ones whose futures they want to protect. They want to make sure the government is going all right so that they can have a good future in their countries. So these students held a demonstration. In Thailand, however, these demonstrations, initially they were local. They weren't spread out throughout the country, soon grew into nationwide protests. And these protests gave rise to a movement that demanded widespread political reform.
So here we've got the phrase to give rise to, which means it has caused something to happen. Okay, so you could say COVID-19 gave rise to unemployment and a weak economy.
Right. So these demonstrations grew and grew so that it became so big that it took over the entire country of Thailand. And what these students wanted, what they demanded, was widespread political reform. Widespread meaning not concentrated, not just in one area, but practically all areas of politics. They wanted reform, and here reform means a change to correct a situation that is wrong. So, for instance, you might want to reform a system that is unfair. many times people hold demonstrations to demand political reform. And that is exactly what happened here in Thailand.
Political reform or government reform. People are saying that, hey, the current system does not work. It needs to be changed. Okay, we're not going to replace it, but we're going to keep the original system, but we're going to make some changes. Maybe get rid of this department and add another department here, reduce the number of people in this department, etc., etc., change around some responsibilities. That would be government or political reform. So by fall, or by the autumn, the peaceful protests had grown in size and intensity despite the COVID-19 pandemic. So yes, by fall, we have these protests going on. They got bigger and bigger. They had grown in size, and they also had grown in intensity. And so here we've got the word intensity. That just refers to how intense something is, how strong it is, how influential it is. And so indeed it became very intense with lots of people shouting, and maybe things were thrown and soldiers maybe started beating up protesters or whatever. It became quite intense.
Right, so these demonstrations began around summertime and they just kept progressing into autumn, into the fall. And what started as demonstrations, when I think of demonstrations, I think of people peacefully walking down the street or holding signs, and they're just expressing their views in a very peaceful, very calm manner. But when you have a protest is more vocal. You can hear it more. It's usually louder and people are more passionate. So the demonstrations turned into a protest or various protests, and they grew in size and intensity despite the COVID-19 pandemic, despite the fact that they should probably have stayed home or social distance. They went out into the streets and they protested.
For example, using that word despite here, I could say, we decided to go to the beach despite the rainy weather. We would rather go on a sunny day, but we still wanted to go to the beach even though it was raining. But in this particular case, these protests continued even though there was this COVID-19 pandemic going on, and those protests engulfed the capital, Bangkok. So here, to engulf as a verb just means it basically gets flooded by this thing. It just totally is controlled by that thing. All these things move in there. So yes, indeed, traffic came to a standstill in Bangkok because these protests were going on. Indeed, they're trying to bring about political reform because the government always seems to have problems in Thailand.
That's right. So these protests engulfed the capital, Bangkok. It slowly took over the city, covering the city so that you can see students in many different places in the streets, stopping traffic, and just basically getting the government to take notice of their demands.
Okay, let's move on now to the second part of our lesson and find out more about the situation in Thailand.
The pro-democracy movement demanded the resignation of Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha, a former army chief who took power in a 2014 coup, along with new elections and changes to the constitution. Many also pushed for reform of Thailand's strict lèse-majesté law, which makes insulting the monarchy a serious crime, punishable by up to 15 years in jail. In October, the government cracked down on the student-led protesters, banning the protests with an emergency order and making dozens of arrests. The crackdown failed to deter activists, however, and thousands of young people defied the order, continuing to gather around the country with renewed vigor. The government's response to the protests also led to greater criticism of the monarchy, which critics say has helped enable military rule.
第二部分我们看到名词 resignation 指辞职、辞呈。举例来说 The president refused to accept the minister's resignation. 总统不接受那位部长的辞呈。另外，这个字去掉字尾 ation 就成了动词 resign 指放弃、辞职。像是 Mike resigned when his boss refused to give him a promotion. Mike 的老板拒绝他升迁，所以他就辞职了。再来，我们看到单字 coup 这个字是名词，指军事政变。例如 A military coup occurred in that small country. 那个小国发动了一场军事政变。 另外，除了上面的意思，这个字还可以指意想不到的成功，像是 We never beat that team, so it was a major coup when we won this time. 我们从未打赢那个队伍，因此这一次赢得比赛是个意想不到的成功。接着我们看到名词 monarchy， 指君主制、君主制国家。例如 The United States government is not a monarchy because it has no king or queen. 美国政府不是君主制，因为他们没有国王或皇后。另外，这个字去掉字尾 y 就成了另一个名词 monarch， 指君主、君王。我们可以说 The king's eldest son is first in line to become the country's next monarch. 国王的长子是那个国家下任君主的第一顺位。再来，我们看到单字 deter， 这个字是动词，指阻止、制止。例如Bill tried to deter tourists from coming near his house. Bill 试图制止观光客靠近他家。接着我们看到动词 defy， 指反抗、违抗。例如 Joseph defied his father's wishes by joining the army. Joseph 加入军队，违抗了他父亲的心愿。另外，补充一个相关片语 defy the odds, O-D-D-S, defy the odds, 表示克服万难、战胜挑战。我们可以说Despite her illness, Emma defied the odds by graduating college. 即使生病 ，Emma 还是克服万难，从大学毕业了。最后，我们看到单字 vigor， 这个字是名词，指气势、力度、精力、活力。例如 The passionate presenter delivered his speech with great vigor. 那名热情讲者的演说充满了活力。
So we're talking about the Thai protests, and we've learned that there were demonstrations going on last summer, the summer of 2020. Now, what were these students demanding? Why were they protesting? Well, it says here, the pro-democracy movement demanded the resignation of Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha, a former army chief who took power in a 2014 coup, along with new elections and changes to the constitution. So they're demanding quite a lot. Not saying they're wrong, but it is a big demand. So first of all, the movement is a pro-democracy movement, which means that the movement believes the government should be elected by the people and laws should be decided by the people. So the opposite of a democracy is a tyranny, when one person decides everything, makes all the decisions. So that's another thing.
That's what they want here. They want a democracy in Thailand, and in order to get that, they demanded that the Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha, they demanded him resign, or him to resign. So yes, to resign means to quit your position, especially if it's a high position, and the process of quitting your job is resignation. You need to submit your resignation. For example, one of my relatives, Uncle Dean, was working for a company and he was stealing money on the side and he got caught. So the boss of the company demanded his resignation, and of course he was prosecuted and found guilty and thrown in jail. Poor Uncle Dean. But in any case here, of course, the protesters are demanding the resignation of this prime minister. And he was a former army chief, so he was in the military there, and he took power in a coup that took place back in 2014. So he's been in power for 6 years, and he was not freely elected by the people. He just took control in a coup. Be careful there with the word coup. It does have a P there, but the P is not pronounced. That just means a violent, sudden takeover of the government, usually by the military.
Right, and that's exactly what the prime minister did. He took over the government. He was a part of the army. He was an army chief, so he took over the government by force. He wasn't elected, and perhaps that is why the students want to remove him from government, because he was never chosen to begin with. So besides the removal of prime minister, the students also want new elections and changes to the Constitution. So they want systemic changes. They want changes to the system of how the government is run. So one way is to change the Constitution. Now, the Constitution is a set of laws or principles that describe the rights and duties of the citizens of a country. It also describes the responsibilities of a government. So, for instance, in the U.S., the Constitution is a very important piece of document. I could say the U.S. Constitution protects freedom of speech, which means it is guaranteed that in the United States, everyone can say what's on their mind or write down what they think, and they will not be punished for it.
Right, the U.S. Constitution, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, etc., etc. And, of course, here in Taiwan, I believe you have a constitution as well. And Thailand has a constitution, but they want some changes made to the constitution so that it's not so easy for military dictators to take over control. Many also pushed for reform of Thailand's strict lèse-majesté law, which makes insulting the monarchy a serious crime, punishable by up to 15 years in jail. Okay, so yes, they want reform of this law, which is called the lèse-majesté law. And what is that law? Well, we don't see it too often, but basically what it means that you cannot insult the monarchy. You cannot call the king bad names or the queen or the princess or whatever. You cannot insult them. To insult just means you say something to somebody else and they would feel very offended. Now, moving on to the next sentence here, it says, in October, the government cracked down on the student-led protesters, banning the protests with an emergency order and making dozens of arrests. So this does not sound surprising at all. Governments don't like this sort of thing, and they don't give in to the demands of students so easily. So they decided to crack down on these protesters, okay? You guys can't do that anymore. If you guys stay here, we're going to start beating you with clubs. We're going to use tear gas and stuff like that. We may even beat you up and send you to prison without a trial and stuff like that. So indeed, they cracked down on the protesters, and then they banned the protests. They said, nope, you can't do them anymore. If you get caught, you'll be arrested and severely punished. And they banned those protests with an emergency order. Okay, that's something that the government came up with, an emergency order. And, of course, as a result, they made dozens of arrests. They took those students down to jail, put them in cells, and probably did not feed them very good food.
Right. Now, the phrase here, crack down, and also the word to ban have been used recently also under the COVID-19 pandemic situation. So the police, for instance, have cracked down on people gathering in the public because that could lead to the spread of COVID-19. So they're cracking down on outdoor gatherings and restaurants staying open, and they're also banning international travel. So these words usually refer to governments being strict about something, but it can also be good for the general public.
So the crackdown failed to deter activists, however, and thousands of young people defied the order. So yeah, these young people were not deterred. The word deter here just means that they did not change their minds. They were not persuaded to do something else. They were not discouraged from these protests. They said, you guys can do whatever you want to us. You can beat us. You can starve us. You can torture us, but we're still going to protest because we believe what is right.
Right. So they were not deterred by what the government and the police were doing to them. Thousands of young people defied the order. And when you defy something, you refuse to obey that thing. You refuse to obey law. So you defy the law, or you defy the authority of your government or of your boss or whatever it is that is your authority.
That's exactly right. So, of course, these protests continued to gather around the country with renewed vigor. Vigor just means energy, and I guess you could say that the government kind of made the situation worse. The government might crack down harder in the future.
Right. So vigor, yeah, it's enthusiasm, energy, determination. So the more the government cracked down, the more vigor or the more enthusiasm the students developed because it just showed them that there was a real need for systemic change in the government, perhaps.
And the government's response to the protests also led to greater criticism of the monarchy, the king and the queen and stuff like that, which critics say has helped enable military rule. So if you're a critic, basically you're somebody who criticizes something, who says something's good or something bad. Critics usually say something is bad. Okay, that brings us to the end of the second part of our lesson. Let's now listen to the third part.
The landmark protests were the latest in Thailand's long history of political difficulties. More military coups have taken place there than in any other country in modern history. Perhaps the recent protests will bring about real change and put an end to Thailand's coup culture once and for all.
And welcome back. So we're going to wrap up now our discussion of Thai protests pushing for real change. Now, the landmark protests were the latest in Thailand's long history of political difficulties. More military coups have taken place there than in any other country in modern history. So we're calling this the landmark protest, or the author is calling it, because it's an important and it's likely to have influence over the future kind of protest.
Yes, we often hear about coups taking place in Thailand. Perhaps the recent protests will bring about real change and put an end to Thailand's coup culture once and for all. So to put an end to something means to stop it. Put an end to slavery, for example, which happened in the United States. And, of course, we want to get rid of coup culture. Get rid of it forever, once and for all. Okay, that brings us to the end of our lesson for today. It's time now to listen to our Chinese teacher.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文一开始提到，去年泰国的学生示威游行演变成全国性的抗议活动，引发了一场要求政治改革的运动。那文中是用到动词片语 give rise to 来表达造成、导致或是引起、促成的意思。那这时候它的意思就跟 lead to 或是 bring about 或是 result in 差不多。那么之后是要接名词，例如 bad eating habits may give rise to various health problems. 不良饮食习惯可能会导致、可能会引起各种不同的健康问题。好，那么课文第二部分写到说，这场支持民主的运动要求总理帕拉育下台。那么文中是用到 pro-democracy 来表达支持民主的。那它的字首 pro 连字号这个部分呢，就表示支持、赞成。好，那么相反的，我们可以用 anti-democracy 或者是 anti-democracy 来表达反民主的。那么字首 anti 连字号的部分就有这个反对、对抗的语义。我们可以再看一组例子，像 pro-government 就是支持政府的， anti-government 或是 anti-government 就是反政府的。好，那么另外课文有一个单字 resignation， 它是用来表达辞职、辞呈，它是来自动词 resign， 就是表达请辞、辞职。我们来学习它的字首字根。好，先来看 sign sign 这个字根就有标记、指示、符号或是签署的意思。像 signal 这个字就是由 sign 再加上名词字尾 al 而来，用来表达信号。好，那么在 resign 这个字当中，它的字首 re 表示相反，那么 sign 表示标记。什么叫做相反标记呢？好，那其实这个字是有典故的哦。它原本在拉丁文里面是指说在账簿上面画反记号来核销原先的注记，那么后来就引申出辞职的意思了。我们顺便补充几个有相同字根的单字。第一个 signify， 它的字根 sign 是指标示，后面加上动词字尾 ify。 那当我们把某事物特别标示出来，就是为了要标示它的重要性，或是为了要说明它的含义等等。那用这样的方式应该可以联想到 signify 可以表达说意味着或是表示、表明、示意。 好，再补充第二个是 assign， 它的字首 as 是来自 ad， 表示朝向，只是因为 ad 摆在 s 之前会拼作 as。好，那它的字根 sign 表示标记。什么叫做朝向标记呢？同学们可以试着想，当你拿着一张单子，针对每个人朝向每个人去标记他们各自要分配的数量或是工作，这样应该很容易联想到 assign 它有指派分配的意思。那么第三个补充的是 design， 它的字首 de 表示 out 向外往外，那么 sign 表示标记。同学们小时候有没有玩过那种依照数字顺序，然后把点点连线起来，把它连成一个图案呢？当我们把标记的东西把它绘制出来、描绘出来，也许可以联想到说 design 它具有设计、构思或是计划的意思了。好，那么以上是今天的重点整理，我们来回顾今天的单字吧。
Demonstration. People gathered outside the government building for an anti-war demonstration. Reform. The politician pushed for reform of the country's healthcare system. Intensity. At the end of the concert, the crowd's cheering grew in intensity. Resignation. Although Aaron's boss was unhappy with the decision, he accepted her resignation. Constitution. The nation's original constitution is displayed in a museum in the capital city. Insult. Emma felt as though her guests insulted her by not eating the food she had prepared. Vigor. The band performed with great vigor at their final concert. Critic. Critics of the president say that he is doing a terrible job at running the country.
Discussion starter starts now.
It's time now for our discussion starter. Do you think it should be a crime to insult the monarchy in Thailand? Why or why not?
Insulting the monarchy should definitely be illegal because if you're going to have a monarchy, which means you respect the leader, then you should not be able to insult them.
Right. Well, people should have the right to say what they want nowadays, but I think it was a good idea not to insult the king in the past because the previous king was a pretty cool guy. He had those glasses and stuff like that, and his picture was all over the money, so I could see why they would not be able to insult him then. I don't know how the current king feels about that, though. Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Roger.
I'm Helen.
See you next time.